Sure. So I'm Jonathan Capra. I'm the communications director for Restore the Fourth. I'm also the host of the Privacy Patriots podcast, as well as a former occupier. And I'm joined today by Rashida Richardson, who's legislative counsel for the New York Civil Liberties Union. I'm going to give my best Hackers of the World Unite speech and then turn it over to Rashida to hear about the important work they're doing in legislation and how all that works. And lastly, we'll do a bit of a Q&A session. So a bit about Restore the Fourth. You may remember it as a minor movement that cropped up on Reddit in the wake of the Edward Snowden revelations in 2013, culminating in a series of marches against mass surveillance. We've since reformed as a 501c4 nonprofit. This means that we can do things like lobby and endorse political candidates. So the Fourth obviously refers to the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. We feel the language of the Founding Fathers reflected the age they lived in, but that it inherently extends to our current reality where our papers are on our hard drive, our smartphone, or in the cloud. Restore the Fourth's mission is to get law enforcement to rely on individual warrants based on probable cause and penalize them when they don't. We want specific targets, not dragnets. Additionally, we look to promote legislation with a few objectives: limiting the third-party doctrine. Rashida can probably expand on that later, but in short, it allows for less privacy when a third party is handling or storing your information. Improving government transparency and fortifying end runs around the Fourth Amendment. So my objectives today are to recognize today's audience as a cohesive community, a movement, if you will, and hopefully get all of you to begin regarding yourselves that way. We want to get you to realize the growing influence that you have and encourage you to get active and involved in public policy. So who's in this community? Once upon a time, we could simply call it the hacker community, but nowadays it's more than just that. We have the coders, both communal and commercial, the information security specialists, the white hat hackers, which is going to be the majority at this conference, fanboys, for lack of a better word, very passionate users for whom the software made by this community is a way of life. And we're starting to see journalists and traditional activists come into the fold. I observed this at last year's HOPE conference, for instance, where alongside traditional hacking, you were just as likely to find panels on protecting sources and FOIA requests. So I'm trying to bring a bit of that to ANYCon today. Lastly, librarians, the original protectors of information. So what influence do we have? I'd say we're on the cusp of being the major force directing the course of society. First, the technologies we've developed have already resulted in a huge culture shift. All we have to think about is the effect of the internet, email, and social media have had on society. But we're starting to see our direct influence on governments. If we look at Anonymous or WikiLeaks or even just notable software projects such as Tor and Signal, we're starting to see our direct influence on government. And this is with very tangible results. We're affecting elections, we're providing transparency, and even directly protecting people's rights with the solutions we provide. You may know the old adage, who watches the watchers. Traditional journalists have typically had that role, but I contend that because of the new economy and a rise in partisanship, that's diminished quite a bit. But I think we're filling that void and becoming the fifth branch of government with a new form of vigilantism. For better or worse, the result is often unvetted, unedited, and open to manipulation. But I believe that our attempts at transparency are doing more good than harm, and I feel we'll continue to evolve and refine this new role and responsibility. So the reason we know we're gaining influence is that governments are starting to take notice. We see evidence of that from the politicians who are responding with knee-jerk legislation. Let's take a look at some of the notable pieces of legislation we've provoked. The federal anti-encryption bill. Luckily, this never got farther than being just draft legislation, but in the wake of the San Bernardino shooting, Senators Dianne Feinstein and Richard Burr wanted to require American software developers to insert backdoors into consumer technology that used end-to-end encryption. It's notable for its ignorant assumption that you can somehow make encryption crackable only for the good guys, but also because it was proposed jointly by a Republican and a Democrat. And interestingly, we've seen that often privacy issues are not a partisan issue. But when dad says no, let's go ask mom. Assemblyman Matthew Titone attempted the same thing on the state level here in New York. The proposed bill said any smartphone that is manufactured on or after January 1st, 2016, and sold in or leased in New York shall be capable of being decrypted and unlocked by its manufacturer or its operating system provider. We saw similar bills crop up in California and in Louisiana as well, leading to some suspicion that the National District Attorneys Association may have been behind this. Another bill of note back in DC was the burner phone bill put forth in the wake of the Paris attacks. More knee-jerk fear over what bad people might do with technology. It would require identification to be presented before you could purchase even a prepaid SIM card for a mobile phone. At the time I wrote this, the Textilizer bill was poised to go to committee here at the Capitol. It would require every driver in New York State to turn over their smartphone for forensic analysis after a car crash using this new device. A group called Parents Against Distracted Driving is the face of this, but if we look behind the curtain, we find the real driver of this bill, Celebrite, a name most of you may know as the ones who cracked the San Bernardino iPhone. This is just one example of what I call a whole parallel bizarro sector of the tech industry that's seeking new and inventive ways for government to encroach on our rights. So furthermore, another instance where we see government responding to our influence are demands from law enforcement agencies. FBI Director James Comey came just short of demanding backdoors be added to encryption software, coining the phrase "going dark" when speaking before Congress. There was, of course, the FBI court order against Apple to unlock the San Bernardino shooter's phone. We know this really meant writing flawed firmware, effectively malware, for their own product, so of course they balked. For better or worse, the Israeli firm Celebrite ultimately offered to hack into it, closing the dispute. Lastly, Cyrus Vance Jr., the district attorney in Manhattan, followed suit when he complained he had 423 locked iPhones related to open investigations. He also called for limits on end-to-end encryption. Another reaction to our influence comes in the form of internet censorship. This has cropped up in different forms in different parts of the world. A popular approach here in the US was site blocking via authoritative DNS. Immigration and Customs Enforcement use this method to target file sharing sites. Without getting too technical, since the US leverages the root DNS servers, they were able to seize these domain names for sites anywhere and redirect them to this ominous splash screen, all without any due process. So then we've seen instances of complete disconnection from the internet at the TCP/IP level, or blocking sites via recursive DNS, i.e. lookup servers. Fortunately, we only really see this in nations that typically have a single upstream internet connection or a single ISP for the whole country. We saw this in Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Turkey. Some of you may remember this graffiti when Turkey tried to block Twitter, instructing people to switch their devices to use Google's lookup servers to get around the ban. Meanwhile, when Egypt tried to block the Signal chatting app, Open Whisper Systems patched their client to redirect Egyptian users through a proxy server. To a lesser extent, we're also seeing governments actually changing their behavior, becoming more transparent. In the wake of the Clinton email scandal, I think politicians are more aware of what channels are actually secure for discussing classified info and what's not. And in the Trump era, we're now seeing officials and staff members finding the value of using encrypted apps like Signal. Lastly, another effect we're starting to have on our government is poaching. We're beginning to see some trend of brain power fleeing Washington, D.C. for Silicon Valley, because the tech sector is really what's directing change in society these days, in contrast with the slow process of traditional government institutions. So what's been holding our community and our movement back? For one, we haven't been around as long, but we have an opportunity to learn from past movements. We have a lot of philosophical issues within ourselves, open source versus commercial, platform wars, even tabs versus spaces. I also think we tend to, as a community, we generally tend to gravitate towards discrete concepts like math and logic. Politics is a lot of the abstract and frankly a lot of BS, so we tend to avoid that. Eliteness. Why worry about laws if you can just write software or protocol to get around it? Fair enough. But we have a larger obligation to society, and we should work to make sure that our values are the norm and not the exception. Read the manual. As our community gets more diverse, we need to be more accepting of people of varying technical ability, as well as design applications with the average person in mind. Think PGP versus Open Whisper Systems Signal. Another obstacle is that the chain is not linked. And what do I mean by that? But we have grassroots organizations that are representing citizens, or to use our terminology, end users, while the tech industry itself has its own organization, lobbying firms like TechNet and the Internet Association. For better or worse, in America, issues don't really come to a head until it cuts into someone's bottom line. So it's going to be important for our movement to unify the two in order to leverage the financial power of Silicon Valley corporations. We're starting to see individual civil liberties issues squeezing that bottom line. Now that customers are moving to non-American solutions for security, a non-neutral internet threatens ingenuity, and ISPs are hampered by government demands for user data. Diversity, especially since marginalized communities are likely to be the initial targets of surveillance, it's important that we're more inclusive to them. But because of that same reason, I feel we naturally will as time moves on. Lastly, there's no good name for this community that I keep talking about. As I noticed once upon a time, it was aptly known as just the hacker community, but we know that that's somewhat of a dirty word to the rest of the world. But as our community grows, it's also not really that accurate anymore. So what do we call ourselves? The digital privacy rights movement, the tech community, just good old nerds? So I invite anyone with a good suggestion on how to collectively characterize ourselves to give suggestions. But if we're a political movement, how do we win? I think it's important that we emulate other movements that have been successful. Two good case studies ironically come from both sides of the spectrum: the gun rights movement and the LGBT movement. Both of these movements are rooted in shared interest. I'd literally say passion. Now, I don't want to minimize anyone's experience by equating the passion of romantic partnership with enthusiasm for firearms, but it involves passion of one level or another. And that makes both of these issues a party issue, I'll call it, as opposed to a cleanup issue. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine a house party. Now picture inviting people to the party versus inviting people to volunteer for the cleanup the next morning. At which one are you going to attract more people? Both gun rights and gay rights are political issues, but they revolve also around fun activities and culture, gun shows, or pride parades. Either one revolves around socializing and fraternization. When you attend a rally for either of these issues, you're likely to be attending an event that has a fun element. When you can combine political issues with social activity, you can get more followers. To contrast, no one is really passionate about, say, healthcare. People worry about healthcare plenty, but they don't get inherently excited about it. There's no healthcare culture. That's a cleanup issue. We have the advantage of our issue being a party issue. We can get together to rally for our rights while doing fun stuff at the same time, which is what I'd say we're doing now. Lastly, both of these successful movements are great examples of strong minorities. Despite being smaller interest groups, they managed to leverage their issues into political prominence. So let's first take a look at what made the gun rights movement successful. And by successful, I want you to think about this. To use the San Bernardino mass shooting as an example, we're now living in a reality where the devices the shooters used to communicate were under more scrutiny than the devices they actually used to commit the killings. Even if you're an ardent Second Amendment supporter, you have to concede that's pretty backward. I think it should be one of our community's foremost goals to at least reach parity for privacy rights. So by this example, the gun rights movement managed to create a third rail issue that can make or break a political career, because a politician can lose the support of this entire block of single issue voters. Another important aspect of the gun rights movement is that we see with shared interests come shared values. Gun enthusiasts are interested in sport shooting and hunting, but within that community, we're likely to see people who are by and large conservative, religious, patriotic, from rural areas, and have a strong sense of self-sufficiency. But I want to suggest that we can find similar correlations in our community. If there's one thing that you take away from my talk today, it's this idea that shared interests equals shared values. Our interests are hacking, making, software development, and use, but what do we value? I would say privacy, an open internet, some degree of information sharing, but also a tendency towards rational thinking and logic. And I'd venture to say that we're more likely to be atheists and agnostics. Whatever we decide they are, we've got to start defending our values. An organization like the NRA has done a good job representing both the interests of the industry and their end users. They've managed to become one of the strongest lobbying forces as a result. One other important attribute of the gun rights movement is a shared narrative. They have a solid shared story, a gospel, if you will, that resonates with their followers. So I urge you to ask, what's our story? On the other side of things, if we look at the LGBT movement, we also see a movement where shared interests are tied to shared values. It's an issue of passion, and it's a party issue rather than a cleanup issue. But the most valuable thing I took away from studying the LGBT movement, particularly when we look at groups like ACT UP in the 80s, is what they called an inside-outside strategy. By this, we're referring to acting inside or outside of the establishment. So ACT UP engaged in grassroots protest and street theater. These were all part of their outside strategy. But at the same time, during the height of the AIDS crisis, they also managed to get people on boards at the FDA, for instance, hence an inside strategy. They were also able to spread their message concentrically. They were slowly able to gain acceptance and support, first from their own family and friends. There were many years where folks coming out had their loved ones turn their backs on them. But eventually they turned the tide and were able to gather those around them as allies. From there, they eventually built critical mass to change public opinion and put pressure on politicians. I lost the page here. So I want to talk a bit more about inside-outside strategy. One thing I learned from being part of the Occupy movement was, I think this is one of their mistakes. They wanted nothing to do with the establishment, so they were only working on the outside, we'll say. They partitioned themselves from electoral politics, and even some of the working groups were chastised for wanting to raise money to support the movement. But like, if we look at our movement, we've done the outside phenomenally well. We've provided leaks of information, we've made hacks as political statements, and we've even created subversive technology that's allowed people to bypass bad legislation and oppressive regimes. But we have to work inside. We have to build coalitions. You know, for instance, we see non-technical groups that are strong supporters of digital privacy, such as CARE, the Center, I'm trying to remember, the Council for American Islamic Relations, because they're most likely to be the targets, the first targets of surveillance. We want to act locally because we tend to have more chance of influence with our state and local governments than we do at the national level. You know, there's going to be, you're going to want to engage in tried and true democratic endeavors such as voting, joining committees, and running for office. But then there's the L word, or lobbying. You know, a lot of us tend to think of that as just something that corporations can do, but at its base level, it just means to influence a politician on a certain issue. And we have the luxury here, being in Albany, that we have access to the Capitol, and it may surprise some people that they are actually a lot more available than you think. You can actually walk the halls of the Capitol, and it's actually not that hard to get meetings with reps. So let's see here. So I want to give you some examples of the power of acting locally. On the state level, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act was a huge success in California. I won't steal Rashida's thunder with this, but basically it limited law enforcement's access to user data from service providers without targeted warrants. And we're hoping to replicate it here in New York. Currently in play in California now is SB 21, which would require strict authorization procedures, policy formation, and government review of any surveillance equipment currently in use or to be purchased by law enforcement, such as license plate readers, stingrays, or officer worn body cameras. On the municipal level, a recent ordinance of note was the Providence Community Safety Act in Rhode Island. While it's a broader police reform bill, it included key privacy and surveillance provisions, such as police camera policies, protection for citizen video recording of police, and bans on targeting individuals or activist groups for surveillance without reasonable suspicion or criminal activity or a warrant. But the holy grail, in my mind, of local action is the Santa Clara Domain Awareness Center privacy policy. Department of Homeland Security sought to construct one of these fusion centers for law enforcement intelligence that was going to deploy about every surveillance toy out there, from facial recognition to stingray cell phone interceptors to license plate readers, and tie them all together in a central monitoring facility. The residents of Oakland were able to come together and get their city council to effectively block this DHS operation in their city. But none of these would have come together without the combined support of various stakeholder groups. So a bit more on lobbying. And So, like I said, when we typically think about lobbying, we're talking about commercial special interest groups who hire people to conduct these meetings and interactions. But at its base level, as I said, it's something that anyone can do, at least at the state level. Lobbying simply means to seek and influence a politician or public official on an issue. With our proximity to Capra, like I said, we have that luxury of physical access. But there are already industry representation organizations that are doing this kind of typical lobbying. TechNet and the Internet Association are two of these kinds of firms, and they've been lending their support to privacy and open internet issues in recent times. And with that, I'm going to attempt to show you a brief video about the Internet Association before I turn things over to my colleague, Rashida. Let's see. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Let's try.
In order to protect a free and innovative internet, some of the most recognized internet companies in the world have joined forces to create the Internet Association. By channeling the strengths of our members.
Sorry, guys. Let's see.
In order to protect a free and innovative internet, some of the most recognized internet companies in the world have joined forces to create the Internet Association. By channeling the strengths of our members, the Internet Association will help educate legislators, regulators, and
one more time.
about protecting internet freedom, fostering innovation and economic growth, and empowering you, the online community. We all have a stake in a free, open, innovative internet. Wherever you are on the web, we hope you'll join the discussion. In order to protect free and innovative internet, some of the most recognized internet companies in the world have joined forces to create the Internet Association. By channeling the strengths of our members, the Internet Association will help educate legislators, regulators, and the media about protecting internet freedom, fostering innovation and economic growth, and empowering you, the online community. We all have a stake in a free, open, innovative internet. Wherever you are on the web, we hope you'll join the discussion.
Thanks so much. And I think I'll turn it over to Rashida.
How should I go back to the slide? Hi, so my name's Rashida. Oh, it's not on the screen.
Oh.
Sorry. Okay. Okay. So my name's Rashida. I'm a legislative counsel at the New York Civil Liberties Union, which is the New York office of the American Civil Liberties Union. So I'm both a lawyer and I do a lot of policy legislative work, but I'm also a lobbyist for the organization. So I'm up here a lot on these issues. I wanted to highlight some of the work that we're doing this year that's relevant to the unnamed community of this room. And then give you some background on how things work up here, because New York has one of the most corrupt governments, but I'll get into that in the next slide. To stress why it's helpful to act. So the New York Electronic Communications Privacy Act is similar to what Jonathan just mentioned, passed in California and also Connecticut last year, and it would require law enforcement to get a warrant before accessing your digital data. So it's kind of twofold, and it's making our state law consistent where current Supreme Court jurisprudence is. So currently, if you were to walk out this building and get stopped and the cops took your phone, they would have to get a warrant to physically access your phone. But if they wanted to not have to do that, they could go to the provider and ask for the same information without a warrant. Most often, they're using lower court orders or subpoenas, which have a much lower legal threshold for them to meet. So for a warrant, you need probable cause to show that the evidence that you're looking for may connect that person to the crime. Whereas for a subpoena, you can just say, I'm investigating something, and that's it, and get access to your information. And it also has a lot of other provisions meant to protect the loopholes that have been created by the federal law, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which was written in 1986. So it doesn't really reflect how we use technology today. And because of that, law enforcement is able to get easy access to your information because they're relying on laws that don't reflect our current society. Next is a more recent bill that came up. It's an Internet Service Provider Privacy Bill, and that was introduced as a reaction to the recent congressional repeal of the FCC privacy rule, which would have required internet service providers to at least give you notice and let you know what information is being collected. And when it came to sensitive information like your health records or financial data, they had to get written consent. So this bill is seeking to try to install some of those privacy protections for internet service providers that have franchise agreements within New York State. It's an effort that's happening around the country, and it's kind of a race against the clock as some states' legislative sessions have ended. Our legislative session is ending next week, so it's a really big push to make something happen on the state level because nothing's happening in Congress. And in fact, they've already introduced another bill which would roll back things from its current state. So the repeal that happened back in March and April ended an FCC privacy rule that looked like it was going to be the biggest privacy protection we had, but it also prohibited the FCC from promulgating any regulation similar to that. So it's really either it's a fix that has to happen on the federal level, which is likely not to happen, or it needs to happen on the state level. And then the other piece about the federal legislation that was recently introduced is that it's meant to undo some of these state efforts. So this is kind of a precarious situation that we're working to get done. Next is the Surveillance Technology and Transparency and Oversight. That's actually a New York City bill that was introduced, and that is similar to some of the efforts that Jonathan mentioned have been happening in California, and specifically, it would require the NYPD to release surveillance impact and use statements for any surveillance technology they acquire, and that definition is pretty broad, so it could include facial recognition software and things that are being developed and we don't even know about, and then other things that we've litigated about. So now you know about like Stingray's automatic license plate readers, or my favorite X-ray vans, which use ionizing radiation to see into buildings and cars. So that bill would require them to release these reports and would give the public a chance to comment and the city council a chance to review. And it's really helpful because currently the NYPD kind of uses loopholes through the local procurement process. So often they're acquiring these technologies either through the NYPD Foundation, which is an outside group and funding to buy technology, through federal grants, or through other means. So a lot of the times we don't actually know what is being acquired until we sue. So the next is Textilizer, which I won't get into, but that's been a reoccurring issue in New York, which has been pushed by both nonprofit and Celebrate, who, in addition to cracking the San Bernardino phone, is also notorious for creating law enforcement forensics software. So this is just their lane, and it's another way to push into technology that they use. And then some of our other work are just surveillance technology specific bills, and this is both offensive and defensive. So sometimes it is a bill that we work on, like there was a Stingray bill that would require law enforcement to get a warrant before using a Stingray. And then there's tons of bills that are introduced that we then have to be defensive. So one that always comes up is like a drone bill that says you can't fly a drone within 1,000 feet of a correction facility, which sounds okay, but if you actually look at what 1,000 feet around a correctional facility is, it includes a lot of people's backyards and private businesses, and there are First Amendment and other interests that one may have in using the drone, so that would inhibit it. Now to explain how corrupt our government is. So the Schoolhouse Rock piece of how a bill becomes a law is accurate, but Albany is a little bit more complicated because if you don't pay attention to the news, we do have a lot of corruption. Just last year, the head of both chambers were convicted of, different things, but corruption in general. And also it's just a lot of dysfunction that makes it very hard for things to get done. So I'll explain how the houses are broken down and then how bills actually become a law or don't become laws in New York State. So we have a bicameral system, so that means two houses just like Congress. The Assembly, similar to the House of Representatives, has historically been a democratically run chambers, and it has over 100 members. The Senate is very complicated. So technically, the Democrats have a numerical majority within the state Senate, but because of what I'm about to explain, the Republicans actually control the House. So there's 31 Republicans, and they are technically the leaders in the in the Senate. And then the Democrats are in a lot of dysfunction. So we have traditional Democrats, there's 24 of them. And then you have the Independent Democratic Conference, which is a group of de facto Democrats that are, they're voted in under the D, but they caucus with the Republicans and often vote with them. Then you have Senator Simcha Felder, who is a Democrat, but often votes and caucuses with the Republicans. And then there's one empty seat that was previously held by Bill Perkins that is historically Democratic, but it's empty right now. So because of that, even though the numbers break down, if you were just looking at D's and R's, the Democrats would run the Senate. The Republicans actually do run the Senate. So you have to it becomes a very partisan game where traditionally our organization can get a lot done in the Assembly, but you can't get anywhere if it can't get through the other house. So you have to kind of work with all of the parties, and I say that liberally since we have our traditional Democrats, Republicans, and then the IDC. Right now, to give you a current update, we're kind of in a political crisis because there's tons of infighting within the Senate, and the New York congressional delegation and the New York, I'm now blanking, conference, like DNC, Democratic National Conference, are pressuring the Independent Democratic Conference to rejoin the party and even threatening to take money away from them if they don't rejoin the party. So they're in a political grandstanding right now where they're trying to flex their power and show that they still have some influence. The head of the Democratic Party in the Senate is trying to force a move, and the Republicans are trying to maintain their ground. So this next week is going to be kind of crazy because we don't know what's really going on and where things are going to shift. And since we're going into an election year next year, a lot of people are scared about their seats. So a lot can happen or nothing can happen within a week. So how a bill becomes a law. Traditionally, bills come from different sources. Sometimes legislators come up with them. Sometimes, or at least from most of my experience, a lot come from the advocacy and constituency community. So sometimes I'm writing the bill and we find a legislator that cares about that issue to carry it, or sometimes legislators will reach out to us knowing that we have an expertise in a certain area and we'll work with them to draft a bill. Sometimes there's program staff, which are like subject matter experts in both chambers. Sometimes they develop legislation based on what's happening in the news or reoccurring issues and problems, or sometimes, like with the ISP privacy bill, reacting to something that's happening on the national level. One of the reasons why I say New York is dysfunctional is because we have the most amount of bills introduced in a year, 15,000. That's a lot. And maybe only 100 will actually move. So often you'll have duplicates of the same bill. So it sometimes is very hard to stay active and know what to support, because you may have 7 bills you need to look at, and unless you want to read every single bill, you won't really know the difference. So that's why we try to be helpful in partnering with people, and we create one-pagers and often try to help dispel what's in a 100-page document of a bill. In order for a bill to really be viable, it has to have a companion in the other house. They're known as same as, and that means every word needs to be the same. So often, if you have one sponsor in one house, they'll hand over the information to the other sponsor so that way they can introduce the same bill, because sometimes you'll have similar bills introduced in different houses, but they're not complete same as's, just because of problems. Then where most bills die is in committee assignment. So depending on the subject matter, a lot of bills that I think the unnamed community would be interested in typically goes to consumer affairs, sometimes code. So the Electronic Communication Privacy Act goes to codes because it's reforming the criminal law. So it will go to that committee, and often it sits there and dies, especially if it's a one-house bill. If you're lucky, it will get a hearing and go up for a vote, and then it will be voted out from that committee. Some bills have to go through multiple committees, so it will move along from each committee, and then all bills, the final resting place typically is the Rules Committee, and then it's up to the leader of whichever house it's in to decide whether the bill will go from the Rules Committee to a floor vote. And often that's another politically tricky area, because sometimes you can have enough support for a bill, but then either the president of the Senate doesn't want it to go to a vote. So even though you know it could pass, it won't go to a vote and it will sit there. And then finally, the bill can be delivered to the governor's desk. And you would think that would be an easy, we won, victory route, but the governor, you kind of have to engage him early on any legislation, because even in this past year, there's been major bills that have passed with overwhelming support in both houses, and he vetoes or pocket vetoes it. So then it has to go back through the same process again. So there is also a certain amount of lobbying that has to happen with the governor beforehand, because it's not always a sealed deal by having it go to his desk. And we're done.
All right. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and thank Rashida for coming and explaining all that. And I'd like to urge you, especially those of you here in the Capital District, if you want to get more active, feel free to visit our table for Restore the Fourth and give us a contact card. And it probably doesn't hurt to recommend that you contact your state reps and tell them to support the ECPA, because we want to get that pushed through. And with that, with a few minutes that we have, and I'll get to questions, but I also just want to give a shout out to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who couldn't be here today, but they just want to note their grassroots wing, the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which you can find out more about at that website. And with that, anybody have any questions? Yes.
Rashida, you mentioned law enforcement tools use X-rays to surveil. So that's actually a health risk.
Mm-hmm.
Could you expand and give a little more detail about that?
Yeah, so X-ray vans, also known as Z backscatters, were a form of technology that came from the war fields. It literally came from Afghanistan, where they used it to search for roadside bombs. And now, and most often, I think they're coming through federal grants is how local law enforcement is getting it, but the NYPD has it, and they've used it on New York City streets. It does have ionizing radiation, which is a major public health risk, and to explain what it does, it can mutate DNA, it can increase radiation and therefore increase your risk of cancer. And this specific type of technology used to be used in airports, but both the US TSA and the European Union has banned the use of this type of radiation because of the public health harms, and the manufacturer who creates the vans said that the vans expose bystanders to a 40% higher dose than the airport equipment did. And on top of that, the vans cost around, I think, they range from $750,000 to $850,000 each. So in addition to like the privacy and public health, civil rights and civil liberties concerns, one thing we push for that local legislation in New York City is it's also a fiscal concern, especially when you're looking at major cuts coming from the federal government, which can affect the state budget and local budget. If just 5 of these X-ray vans are purchased, then that's millions of dollars for exposing us to public health risk, looking inside our homes and cars, which is like creepy in itself. And that's also money that you're then like, could that go to schools? Could it go to infrastructure? Could it go to a lot of other things, particularly when we know from just Edward Snowden's revelations and other information about mass surveillance that this mass collection of information doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to stop crimes or necessarily stop a terrorist attack, because it's hard to look through the vast amount of information that's being collected. So, yeah.
Any other questions? In the back. Yeah. That's you.
So you mentioned law enforcement and cell phones. So in the instance of, say, a traffic stop, you pull over to a stop sign violation or something, and they want your cell phone, or more specifically the access code. What exactly are the current laws regarding that?
Well, I believe it gets a little murky right now. There was recently a judicial ruling that pretty much says that you need a warrant to access that information. But as we see, you know, we have these local state bills that they're trying to, you know, kind of go the opposite direction. And as well, we have instances at the border that have become notorious where the Border Patrol sees fit to grab someone's cell phone. So right now it's kind of Wild West.
You can just say no. Because in that situation, if you're stopped and they ask to see your phone, technically the case law says they need a warrant. So you could just say, you need to get a warrant for it. Technically they could say, like, if it's a stop because you ran a light, that's a little different because there's exceptions to the warrant. So if they say it's an emergency exception and they need to see, then they need to have a showing to do that. So a stop, like running a stop sign, really isn't an emergency. So you could actually challenge that. But this is where it's like, it's hard to give a clear answer. But the law right now, if you're stopped, they ask to have your passcode or see into your phone, you could say no, and they have to get a warrant. But they could, if, let's say you get a ticket and then they have your information and whatever reason they're trying to get into your phone, they could go to Verizon, AT&T, or whoever your provider is to get information. Or if they're trying to get access to your email or whatever, they could go to the provider and get it without a warrant.
And yeah, without the ECPA, they could go get that stuff without a warrant, just with a subpoena or something much less than that, correct? Yeah. So at the very least, we want to see them have to take the extra effort at least to get a warrant and go to a third party than to just willy-nilly have access to your phone on site. Over there. Yep, you.
So what's one action point they could take away that you could go home and maybe this weekend or next weekend and do something that's helpful? What would that something?
Well, in this area, I'd reiterate calling your reps for support for the CPA. You know, I think we're kind of a small chapter here, Restore the Fourth in Albany. So if, you know, I'd love to take the opportunity to get together with some of you in the future and kind of game plan some of that. But I mean, there's going to be lots of opportunities to kind of interact with politicians in the future and kind of make our voice heard. You know, another thing is to start thinking about the different stakeholders that are in your community and maybe start engaging them in conversation and seeing where the commonalities are on these issues, like different communities are going to have different reasons why they want to support digital privacy rights and such. And, if we can kind of connect with each other first, then we can figure out the next steps about all of this process that we, unfortunately have to go through, and it's going to be different for state and municipal level. So that's where it starts. Once we get enough of us together, then we can, as we've shown, especially let's say in Oakland, then you kind of have this critical mass, and they can figure out, traverse the processes of traditional democratic institutions. I know by the description, it's maybe not the most appealing thing to want to get involved with, but unfortunately, the folks on the other side will kind of determine our society and how we live if we don't.
So if you want to do something within the next week, that's very helpful. So the New York Electronic Privacy Act, you should write down these two bill numbers. It's the Assembly bill is A1895A, and you can call your your assemblyman, but it's also helpful to call Speaker Carl Hasty's line and say that they need to bring the bill to a floor vote. And then in the Senate, the bill is S6044. You can call Senate President Flanagan in the same request that the bill needs to go to a floor vote, because pretty much by the session ends by Wednesday. So if there's more constituent outreach today, over the weekend, and even on Monday, it's more likely that the leaders in both houses will feel pressured to actually move. So that's what we've been doing for the past week, is adding a lot of pressure to make sure the bills go to a floor vote and can hopefully pass and be not vetoed by the governor.
Can you reiterate Heasty's role and why it's important that we talk to him about it?
So Speaker Hasty is the head of the Assembly, and Senator President Flanagan is the head of the Senate. They control what bills come out of the Rules Committee, where most bills are stuck, and decide which bills go to the floor for a vote. So the more they hear from constituents, the more they hear from people that this needs to be voted on, the more likely that they are actually to move the bill.
Okay, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. So enjoy the rest of the conference. And I also encourage you, if you want to check out our podcast, Privacy Patriots. Have a good one.